There is quite a bit of analysis of a number of dynamics related to the history of the indigenous people of the Americas and the colonizers who also refer to themselves as settlers. There are a number of conversations and analyses related to these relationships and the different things that came out of these interactions. One thing that stands out in looking at the Indian treaties is that, well, there are a couple of things that come up. One thing that really stands out is that the Indian treaties are not treaties at all. They are basically fake treaties. They are not legitimate agreements. And an interesting thing comes out of this. There are a number of things that the Indian treaties are supposed to serve as a foundation for. One, of course, would be the founding of another nation that's on top of it. And this includes not only America, the United States, but also you have some treaties going on related to the land in Canada, treaties related to the land in Mexico, and then again, of course, the treaties related to the land in general mainland North America. Um, but what's coming up when considering that the original treaties are not legitimate, they are not real, then everything that comes out of it also is not real. And so these great treaties that people believe all of these other agreements were founded upon, these things are not real. And so therefore they don't serve as a real foundation for anything else. And so all of these other agreements and arrangements and geopolitical structurings that came out of that, those are not real. Now, if they were not founded upon these purported Indian treaties, then perhaps there could be another argument made to give them legitimacy. But right now, as it stands, there is quite a bit of illegitimacy going on with respect to these agreements and these geopolitical understandings that we have in current times. What's interesting about these treaties, just on a foundational level, is there is no clear understanding as to when the first treaty was actually created. Because these treaties that were purportedly created with the indigenous people, with the original people, um, one thing that's missing is an understanding of who the parties were. Are we actually talking about nations, and are we actually talking about legitimate representatives of these purported nations? And I would argue that we don't have clear nations identified, and then we don't have a clear understanding that actual representatives of the nations were in attendance with respect to these agreements, or that these individuals actually had the authority to be making these purported agreements. And then you have the whole dynamic of the purported agreement itself. And so we don't even have clear agreements. And so there's a lot going on that bring into question the legitimacy of these treaties. And this would explain why the treaties have been sort of wholesale ignored, because they don't really exist. And so there's nothing really to respect with respect to the treaties on one side or the other. And so the indigenous people don't have anything that they are bound to respect. And then the individuals who are calling themselves the Americans, they don't have anything really that they are bound to respect with respect to these agreements. And so basically all you have are original nations of people, and then individuals who are occupying the land with, again, no legitimate agreement, accord, or treaty to substantiate any of this. There are so many purported treaties in existence. It's very difficult to have an accurate count of exactly how many treaties there are supposed to be, how many treaties were ratified, were they legitimately ratified, who were the entities involved in the ratification, who were the entities involved in these agreements. It's all pretty up in the air. And so basically, you don't really have a legitimate anything going on with respect to these purported treaties. And you can see here that in 1722, that's when that great treaty was purportedly agreed to. And this involved those 5 nations. You will often see that there are listings of 5 nations or 6 nations. There was something apparently important about the numbers 5 and 6 because you just see this repeated over and over again. The 5 civilized tribes, the 6 great nations, so you see this repeatedly with respect to these purported agreements. And regardless of how many numbers you're talking about or the entities that are being referenced, the treaties all just appear to be fake, or at least up until this point, I have not come across a treaty that appears legitimate based upon just the basic premises of contract law. And so those things just don't seem to be in place. And another weird thing about the treaties is that it looks like the settlers were treating or making these treaties with themselves through these miscegenation processes. And so they would, over time, because we're talking about hundreds of years that this stuff was going on, over time, they would insert themselves into the original nations, the First Nations, and then start negotiating with themselves or negotiating with the other settlers. And so you basically have a settler who was also a descendant of someone in one of the original nations, and those individuals would often be the spokespersons for the Indian nations. I want to keep saying original nations because the word Indian is actually used as a form of historical, cultural, and linguistic manipulation. It's all that we have to hang on to at this point, really. However, it's perhaps better in most instances to indicate that you're talking about the First Nations, the original nations, regardless of these names that these colonizers came up with or that they superimposed onto the original people. Most people understand what original means in English, what first means in English. They essentially mean the same thing. And so they are not as confusing as a number of other concepts. We know what we mean when we say the First Nations, the original nations, the nations of the soil that sprung up from the soil. They didn't come from somewhere else. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about those people coming up with negotiations with respect to the people who were coming in from somewhere else. And so that's where things get a little muddy. And the muddiness is largely around the sham negotiations that were going on. And in many instances, what appears to be no negotiations at all. These were just games being played by some entities with some sociopathic sorts of leanings in terms of the way that they were negotiating. Everything was about being slick and sly and wicked and getting what they wanted. There were all sorts of odd dynamics going on with respect to referring to the president or referring to the king as their father, as everyone's father, and then purportedly getting the original people to agree with this whole fiction. And a lot of these activities, notably, they seem to coincide with odd dynamics in Europe and then odd dynamics with respect to Africa. And so when there were significant historical things going on in Europe, Scotland, Ireland, England, Cornwall, Wales, France, Spain, whenever there were significant things going on over there, then there would also be, interestingly, significant things going on in what came to be the colonies. Also, simultaneously, significant things going on the west coast of Africa specifically. And so all of these entities were pretty much lockstep. And so when you see things significant going on with respect to these treaties in 1722, you see all of this significant stuff going on with respect to the Scots, who in many ways appeared to be both cowards and opportunists. And so some of these ancestors that people are really proud of, that's really what that boils down to. When you look at the Dutch and you look at the Scots, you look at the French, of course you look at the Spanish, the Portuguese, you see a lot of opportunists. Scotland in particular, they did not have the strength to hold their own on their own land, but they had no problem bringing their little happy selves over to the Americas and making a go of it. And you hear this theme over time anyway when people are moving around the world. They can't make it work where they are, but if they can just get to somewhere else where someone has already made it work, then they can also make it work for themselves. And so Scotland is a real good prototype for this specialness going on. And you can see this when you look at the individuals who had prominent positions in the New World. You often see these Scots names. When you look at individuals who were major traders, you see these Scots names. When you see individuals who were highly invested on the west coast of Africa, you see this sort of Scots Irish identity. You see a lot of French identity. When you look at all of the different islands in the Americas, you see the manifestations of these entities that apparently couldn't make it work wherever they were, or they were trying to escape, but they felt certain that they could make it work on someone else's land. And if you look at what has taken place, I guess they have made it work. And so back to the whole dynamic of the history of these treaties. It indicates here, looking at this historical background, that from 1774 until about 1832, treaties between individual sovereign American Indian nations and the United States were negotiated to establish borders and prescribe conditions of behavior between the parties. I argue that that's not what's really going on inside of the treaties that do appear to exist. Again, it does not appear that specific sovereigns and representatives of those sovereigns were doing the negotiating. It doesn't look like the negotiations were fair negotiations. It doesn't even look like the negotiations were honest negotiations. And in some instances, the treaties looked like just a bunch of childish rhetoric, wherein there is nothing that really looks like a legitimate treaty coming out of it. And so it goes on to indicate the form of these agreements was nearly identical to the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War between the U.S. and Great Britain. If you haven't actually looked at the treaties, you might actually believe that at first blush, but these treaties were nothing near what would be considered a formal contract. The negotiations ended in a mutually signed pact that had to be approved by the U.S. Congress. Non-tribal citizens were required to have a passport to cross sovereign Indian lands. All of this very interesting stuff going on here, but again, no clear sense that legitimate treaties had been created. And again, it often just looks like settlers negotiating with themselves and creating this stuff that could be passed down. We'll talk about that wampum belt stuff also, which really brings into question whether or not these were actual treaties or contracts. From 1832 until 1871, American Indian nations were considered to be domestic, dependent tribes. It took hundreds of years to get to this point. And so when you look at it, of course, it's hundreds of years ago, but it took hundreds of years to get to this point of referring to the sovereign nations of the Americas as these domestic, dependent tribes. And these time frames are oddly tied to, again, things that were going on in Africa, things that were going on in Europe, and then also things that were going on with respect to slavery. And so these Indian histories are strangely attached to dynamics related to slavery. It's almost as if they are lockstep. And so when something was happening with the American Indians, as they were calling them, there was also something purportedly happening with individuals that would be considered enslaved, that they were referring to as colored or referring to as African. And that makes things even more confusing, even to the point of you not really seeing Indian people appear in the census until all of a sudden the freed people who had been enslaved, when they start appearing in the census, all of a sudden you see the Indian people start to appear in the census. And not only do you see that oddity going on, but the Indian people, based upon these treaties, their identities largely changed because they became what are known as American citizens, and so therefore they took on one of the American citizen identities in many instances. And there was all this weird stuff going on with these racial descriptors. But again, there was just a lot of odd stuff going on, a lot of game playing going on with these identities and these racial categories that seem to be tied to not only colonization, but slavery, what took place with the indigenous people, and also with additional migration coming into the Americas. And so all of these identities got very conflated. This isn't just in mainland America. You saw this in some places like Suriname, Jamaica, where you have different cultures coming in from different parts of the world, and then they become an amalgamation. And so we see this repeatedly going on, and that's why it's very difficult to have these, clear lines of demarcation with respect to who is who in terms of these ethnic identities. It's not really always so clear. And using phenotype is not really as helpful as many people would think, because you have people who came from England who were darker, who would be classified as coming out of, and that's also important to keep in mind, they would be classified as coming out of India, but they would also be called Africans, or they would be called blacks or Negroes or Moors. They would have so many different identities, and then they would, come over from England. And then there were individuals who were coming over from Africa who also had all of these ties to Europe. And sometimes they look like the people who were in India. They might look like the people who were in Europe, and then they sometimes look like the people who were indigenous to the Americas. So this became very, very confusing with these phenotypes that look very similar in many instances. This story goes on to indicate here that in 1871, the House of Representatives ceased recognition of individual tribes within the United States as independent nations with whom the U.S. could contract by treaty. This ended the nearly 100-year-old practice of treaty making between the U.S. and American Indian tribes. This ended this practice of pretending to make treaties, because these treaties are not legitimate. And if someone can pull up a treaty and show it to me and show where that it fits the criteria of a general contract, I'd be more than willing to look at it. But just all of the elements of a contract just do not appear to be present. And some people think that the U.S. House of Representatives recognition of these individual Indian tribes, they think that it has something to do with their Indian identity. That's like somebody from another family telling you who your various family members are. It doesn't really matter what happened with these treaties. It really has nothing to do with one's ancestry. I mean, absolutely nothing to do with Indian ancestry. Someone else can't just decide to go against the laws of nature and make up all of these different family relationships and these weird things called blood quantum. These things make no sense, but it's been going on for so long that people have embraced it and they believe that it has some sort of legitimacy. That's why you will hear people say they are full blood Indian. That makes absolutely no sense. None. I mean, there's nothing you can really do with that because it makes absolutely no sense. It's like saying, you are 100%, a member of the Miller family. Okay, you're a 100% a member of the Miller family. Um, there's really no such thing as this whole 100% of anything. No one really knows, how far back their ancestry goes or whether every single ancestor they've ever had was coming from growing up out of the American soil. And it really doesn't matter because ancestry and heirship works in such a way that all of this foolishness that has been concocted in these treaties and all of these negotiations that have gone on throughout time, they are inconsistent with what we call probate law. They are inconsistent with the laws of nature. They are just pretty asinine. And what's even more asinine is that we in current times have gone along with these things like they actually make sense. They make no sense. And the more we buy into things that make no sense, it's not a problem with the people who created this nonsensical foolishness. The problem becomes us because we are the ones who are deciding to co-sign on that which is ridiculous. And some of this is because people are trying to hold on to anything that they can hold on to that ties them to a particular identity, whatever that identity happens to be. And sometimes that's the very thing that gets in the way. People want to be tied to a particular Indian group. They want to be identified as Cherokee, or they want to be identified as Choctaw or Sioux, or it doesn't matter, any Mojave, Mohawk. Lenape. They want to be tied to these entities. And so therefore, they often won't even bring into question the questions about those particular entities because some of these entities also appear to be made up entities just like these treaties are made up. And some of these made up entities are some of the ones who participated in these made up treaties. But if individuals are tied to those identities, they appear to be less likely to bring up the fact that a lot of this stuff appears to be made up. And there isn't a lot of foundation to hang one's hat on, whether we are talking about those who are identifying as American, those who are identifying as any of these collectives in the Americas at the present time. There's just not a lot of foundation to hold on to with respect to a lot of these agreements or these identities. Either people are, from the original people or the last people that we know of, or they are not. What the name is may not be as important because many of the names, again, have been superimpositions. You'll hear people talk about a Lenape name or an Algonquin surname or any of these groups, and then they will give you these European names. It's like, really? And so they aren't even recognizing the fallacy in tying themselves to these European identities and then claiming that these are the real identities for the indigenous people. If that's the case, then the indigenous people that they are latched on to related to these names are apparently not the indigenous or the original people because these are European names. And the European names that we have came from Europeans one way or another, but they are certainly not, unless the indigenous people or the original people of the Americas are someone other than they are believed to be. These names are superimpositions, and they don't really solidify anything for anyone. It's fascinating, the stories that people will come up with as soon as you question these types of things. They will start to talk about all of these far-fetched dynamics, such as suggesting that the American Indians, their native tongue was English. Mm-hmm. Or the American Indians were the ones who colonized Europe. There's really no proof of any of this stuff, but there are certain collectives of people that like to push this sort of psychological operation. And yes, it is a psychological operation. If you look at the meaning of a psychological operation, what goes into a psychological operation, you can see that that's a big part of a number of the dynamics that you see, even with some of these narratives related to the Hebrew Israelites. Some of that is clearly a psychological operation. When you look at the fact that you've got a collective of people who are claiming to be both the enslavers and the enslaved, because that kingdom of Judah on the west coast of Africa, that was the major slave trading kingdom. That, according to some narratives, the script got flipped and they became enslaved after enslaving for long periods of time, and being in complete agreement with a number of the European nations. And so this was a confederacy even then. So even that so-called Kingdom of Judah was a confederacy with England, with France, with the Dutch people, with the Spaniards, with the Portuguese. So there were all of these confederacies going on with all of these different people. And it all makes it very difficult to have these clean lines of demarcation about who all of these various people happen to be and how they came to be in the Americas. And here you see these interesting wordings with respect to these agreements, and this is coming from the World History Commons, but this is coming from what was supposed to be that 1722, the Great Treaty Agreement, that was translated into Dutch, and then we have it in English. And it indicates here propositions made to the 5 nations of Indians, to wit, I cannot pronounce that word. The other one looks like Oneidas. The other one looks like Onondaga, Cayuga, Senecas, looks like Senecas, and His Excellency, by His Excellency, Alex Spotswood, Esquire. And then you have Governor of His Masters, that's what that looks like, Dominion of Virginia and Albany, 1722, present, His Excellency Alex Spotswood again, Esquire, Governor of Virginia, what looks like Colonel Nathaniel Harrison, Esquire, of His Majesty's Council of Virginia, Colonel, again, William Robinson, Esquire, a member of the House of Burgesses of Virginia. And so you have all of these people. These are supposed to be the representatives that are making the treaty on behalf of, it's not completely clear. And then it's interpreted by Lawrence, not sure of the last name there, after it was translated into Dutch by what appears to be Robert Livingston, the Sachem, and warriors of ye 5 nations. We don't even have to get into this word SACHAEMS and SACHIMS. This is an interesting word and construct. It's purportedly the word for chief for the 5 nations. However, that's not what that word is. And of course, as you can imagine, it is tied to Hebrew. Of course, it would be tied to Hebrew because you have all of these entities, these Moriscos and Marranos, that are orchestrating all of this stuff that's going on. And with all of this specificity in terms of the title and the rank of these individuals that are purportedly representing His Excellency or His Majesty, you don't really have the same thing going on with respect to these entities that are supposed to be representing these various original nations. You don't really know their names. You don't know their official titles. You don't know who gave them these titles, who's even calling them these names. It's like someone calling themselves your father and you don't even know them. So that's what's going on often in these situations. And so you don't see these names like Alexander Spotswood. You see we the Sachem or the Sakim or the Sakum. It's pronounced in a bunch of different ways, interestingly. So you see we, the, whatever that is, of the five nations, and then the nations are listed together with the, looks like Tuscarora, are come here upon His Excellency, the governor of New York's message. Brother, whatever this is saying, you told us some days ago that the five nations say that ye covenant chain, which was made betwixt us and Virginia 50 years ago, is grown rusty, and that we did not long keep or observe the condition of it. Who are these people talking, and what on earth are they talking about? You have forbid us to pass the south side of the great river. Whatever the name of that great river is there, which you call, looks like the Potomac, okay, or to the east side of the great ridge of mountains, which extend all along the frontiers of Virginia. What are they talking about? What can you really do with this? Do you really see clear boundary markers going on here? Do you see real people that you can identify actually coming up with these agreements? Do you actually know who is talking so that you can have the heart of the matter and that you can understand the meat of whatever is being said? No, you don't, because it's completely confusing. It's completely confusing with respect to who these parties are and what these parties are talking about and what these parties are representing and who these parties are representing. It's very confusing. And so therefore, it's not possible that there's an actual contract going on here. We don't even have people speaking the same languages. So we don't even have these narratives in the various languages simultaneously side by side to say that we have sort of this mirror image agreement going on. We have nothing. Many believe that these wampum belts are actual manifestations of a treaty. However, individuals would be hard pressed to demonstrate exactly how that is the case. Now, often you see these wampum belts offered as the treaties that the American Indians offered in the treaty process. And so the wampum belt is supposed to contain the agreement. I offer to you that there is probably no one here in existence today that can read to you the wampum belt that you see on the screen and have that wampum belt coincide with the treaty, the written treaty that we have in the best version of English that we have. I offer to you that that doesn't exist. That person doesn't exist who can do that sort of thing. And I offer to you that there's nothing to show that this wampum belt is a manifestation of any agreement that these two sides came up with. Because you'd have to have both sides understanding the wampum belt in order for this to have been an actual agreement, an actual contract that these entities came up with. Now, somebody might say, well, this is the representation of the agreement. Okay, whatever that means, it means nothing. Yet again, just like these agreements, just like these treaties, just like these geopolitical foundations upon which all of us are resting right now. And here you see yet another one of these fake treaties in the form of a wampum belt. No one can even tell you who created the wampum belt. We'll just start right there. We don't know when these wampum belts were created. We don't know who created them. We don't even know why they were created. And so for people to offer that these wampum belts were created as manifestations of a treaty, those individuals are just pretending. They know by and large that they don't know what they are talking about, and they know by and large that these purported treaties in the form of wampum belts are illegitimate. They are not real. And there's no one who can present significant evidence to support the idea that these fake treaties are actual real treaties serving any real purpose. And so, according to these narratives, that wampum belt is supposed to have in it the contents of the information from the treaty. So we have the Indian Treaty Series, and this is 1722, and this is a treaty between, these governors, these leaders of New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and the Five Nations, August 14th, 1722, conference held at Fort George in New York, and the subsequent Indian treaties thereon. Certified copy. Do you really believe that what's written right here is embedded in the wampum belt? So do you really believe that someone would be reading the wampum belt and they would pull that out of it first and foremost? Do you really think that that's a possibility? Or is all of this contrived? I offer to you it's all contrived. This is not inside of the wampum belt. And even if it was inside of the wampum belt, there are very few people who could read that and extract that out of the wampum belt. Certainly, you probably cannot do it. I certainly cannot do it. I can read the English that is offered, and even that is quite ridiculous when you look at it. And so you have all of these treaties, and you have these people that get upset because they don't see their family's name included in one of these treaties, like, the Dawes rolls, and there's some other rolls, Baker rolls, and the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek stuff. And the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek is a perfect exercise in the creation of a fake treaty, a perfect exercise in the creation of a fake contract. There is no contract with the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. It's just a demand. It's just a doctrine that has been presented as a treaty. That's not a treaty. That's not an agreement. It's nothing but bullying. It's nothing but colonization. It's occupation. That's what it is. It's nothing more and nothing less. And everything that has come out of it is just coming out of this manifestation of this bullying, this occupation and dynamic by these various people around the world for the most part. So, of course, you have the Europeans, you have the Asians, you have the Africans that are all participating in this occupation dynamic that continues on. And you'll often hear people complain about migration in current times. The reason why they really can't, aren't, won't do anything about what they consider to be this problematic migration is because the individuals who are complaining are basically descendants of colonizers themselves. And so what they are complaining about are the super colonizers, the ones that are better colonizers than they are, or that their ancestors happen to be. And so that's a lot of what has taken place and what people are actually dealing with. These treaties are not legitimate, plain and simple. And here you can see a handwritten example of what was supposed to be the original writing for the treaty. And so it's written in cursive versus the typed transcript of it. But as you can see here, there's, again, a very low likelihood that all of the indigenous people were sitting around reading these treaties, agreeing to them, or even giving anyone the power to represent them with respect to these treaties, with these meetings with the governor of Virginia, the governor of New York, the governor of Pennsylvania. It's just highly unlikely that all of the indigenous people, all of the original people, were on board with any of this. And when you look at how some of the treaties took place, you can see that there was significant conflict going on. And often there were individuals who were claiming to represent the Indians. They were claiming to represent the original people, the First Nations, and they really didn't have the authority to do that. They were living very well. You can see some of the houses, the mansions that some of them lived in. They were supposed to be Indians, or they were supposed to be the First Nations, but they were so blended with the colonizers that they really were simply representing the interest of the colonizers. And again, there's just a replica of this whole paradigm going on the west coast of Africa where they did the same thing. So this was some sort of European paradigm, and apparently a European paradigm that lighter and darker Europeans were using in order to colonize these different places and usurp the identities, usurp the power, and take all of the resources from these different people, west coast of Africa, east coast of Americas in particular. And I just wanted to go over a few things related to contracts so that people have a better understanding of what it is I'm talking about when I am critiquing these purported treaties. A contract, which is what a treaty is supposed to be, an agreement, an accord. A contract is supposed to be an agreement between two or more entities. They don't have to be people, it could be companies, but in these instances, we are talking about people, and in some instances, we're talking about people who are representing nations, according to these narratives. So it's supposed to be an agreement between two or more entities, and it's supposed to reflect a mutual understanding. And we're talking about land. We are talking about a very specific type of mutual understanding and mutual agreement. And so it's not some minor issue that you can just do a handshake with, okay, even though there was something like that going on. And so there's supposed to be a mutual understanding. Both parties are supposed to be understanding what it is they are getting into related to the future behavior and promises made by the two sides. And so there are supposed to be promises that are being made about how each side, how each entity is going to behave in the future and how they're going to relate to each other. And just having these drawings, these pictures of shaking hands, that really means nothing. And so it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that there was an agreement. It doesn't prove a mutual understanding. It doesn't prove an understanding of future behavior and promises expected. And so, what we should be seeing if we were seeing legitimate treaties, we should be seeing both sides promising to do something, that they are offering something. They are offering to do something. So we should see that. What's the offer? And so in many of these instances, it appears that those individuals who were representing these monarchs in Europe, they were initiating the entire bargaining process. And so they should have been offering something. And so where is the offer? What exactly is the offer that is being made? And then the original nations should be clearly agreeing to the offer. And so it should not be ambiguous. It should be a clear agreement to whatever is being offered. Think about that in your own life. If you make a contract with someone, they offer something, you accept it, but there's clarity about what's being offered and what's being accepted. And then there's supposed to be a meeting of the minds. There's supposed to be a mutual assent, a mutual agreement. And these entities, it needs to be clear that they are intending to be bound. Even a marital agreement is a contract. And so there needs to be a manifestation that these two entities are intending to be bound. It's the same thing with a contract, any type of contract, that the two parties are meaning to be tied to one another with respect to this agreement. And then they need to exchange something. So there needs to be something that's given in exchange for something else, or a promise to perform in the future. And so that's not always clear in these purported treaties. So we don't see clear offers. It's not clear what's going on exactly. What we see is an offer to take something. Okay, so it's the colonizer offering to take the land off of the hands of the indigenous people. This is ridiculousness. Okay, they are offering to take the resources, take the land, take the rights, take the freedoms. They are offering to do all of that in exchange for, it's not completely clear, in exchange for, sometimes there would be in exchange for other Indian land that the colonizers also didn't own. And so they might offer that, or sometimes they did offer the sort of the non-molestation sort of clause. They would offer that they wouldn't bother the indigenous people if they would simply give them all of their resources, or that they might promise that their mutual father, the king, okay, was going to look favorably on his Indian or his colored or his red children. And so that was sometimes what was offered in exchange for all of the land and all of the resources. This is completely asinine. And only an asinine person would believe that these agreements were legitimate. And so that's what you see missing from these agreements, these legitimate offers, legitimate acceptance, meeting of the minds. Definitely do not see meeting of the minds. And with the coercion that was going on with some of these agreements, you can see that there was a definite non-meeting of the minds. And so there were other things that were offered in order to get what the colonizers wanted. And then there's supposed to be, again, that whole exchange. And often there is no real exchange. What's also very interesting about the written contract that's written in English or translated into the Dutch or whatever they have going on, into the French, into the Spanish, what's also interesting is that you have this document and that's translated in these various languages. And that's supposed to be the reduction of the agreement in writing. Okay. And so when the other side accepts, they are supposed to be accepting what's there. And so there's supposed to be this clear agreement to this offer. But what's going on here with this wampum belt introduction even is you've got something else written, and it's not what's known as a mirror image. So you have that mirror image rule. If you give someone an offer, you give them a contract, in other words, for them to sign. You signed it, you give that to them. And they write something else on there that can be taken as a counter offer. And so essentially it's a new contract that's being offered back to you. And you sort of switch places where the original offerer becomes the person who's accepting, and then the person who was the original offeree turns into the offerer, and so they are making another offer. And so we don't even know what's in the wampum belt in order to know whether or not we ever had what would be considered a mirror image, the exact same thing. They are signing the same thing. We don't have that. What we have are these different manifestations of something that people are calling an agreement or a contract or a treaty, but we are not completely clear that these are the same agreements. And also when you look at the ones that are in English that have been finally translated into English in some instances, even those things are not very clear. They are all over the place. With all of these discussions, and it takes quite a bit to even get to something that looks like an agreement or even agreement that's on the table. It's just they are just very, very murky. And when you have very, very murky stuff, you do not have a clear agreement. And with respect to these so-called treaties, that's what we have, a bunch of murky stuff. And you really don't have legitimate agreements, and so therefore you don't have legitimate responsibility to even uphold both sides of these purported agreements. And so these individuals who gave up their rights to go to Oklahoma and set up these other sovereign nations, and instead they stayed behind and became members of the United States. That agreement's not even a legitimate agreement. It's not based on anything that, we can really take out of a legitimate treaty. And then the ones who went out to Oklahoma, they don't even really have a legitimate treaty. So there are no legitimate agreements all the way around. And then we have a complete sitting government right now, sitting governments, because we have, the United States, and then we have Canada, and we have Mexico. We have all of these entities that are based upon these treaties that are not apparently legitimate treaties. And so, if you're looking at it technically and you're looking at it realistically, we basically just have nothing on the table. We have a doctrine called the doctrine of discovery. That's what we have. We have some papal bulls that some entities latched onto and made it real. And so for those entities, that's definitely a treaty for them. And so whatever grew out of that for them, I guess those entities could understand those things as legitimate, but they are based upon these other entities that did not willingly, happily enter into these various agreements. And of course, you can't change a person's ancestry. It doesn't matter what the phenotype is. One's ancestry is one's ancestry, and it does not change based upon politics. But what we have with these situations, with these miscegenation dynamics, is we have a number of individuals that are representing interest. They are fraudulently representing interest. They, in many instances, were created. Their very existence on this earth was sort of a long game kind of dynamic, with a plan for them at some point in time to serve as these Confederates. They were to serve as double agents, basically. And what they did was to, in some instances, when miscegenation was a part of the dynamic with these different ethnic groups, they basically they were involved in double dealing. And so therefore they made decisions to turn their backs on one side of their family in favor of the other side of the family. And because the conniving was coming from, generally speaking, their European, Asian, and African sides of their families, the manipulation was in relation to or against their American family members, or their indigenous family members, their nations, their tribes, their clans. But again, we've talked about that whole idea of tribe and clan also is not necessarily an indigenous American construct. But that is the way that this took place, whether we were talking about the west coast of Africa or the Americas. And there is a lot of indication that this went on in Asia also. And so you had these individuals who wanted land, wanted resources, wanted power, and they married into those families too, whether we are talking about India or in more central western portions of Asia. And of course, this dynamic went on the west coast of Africa, without a doubt.